Who should replace Eddie Jones, folks? That's a question posed to Rugby Australia right now. After him having resigned, they are in the situation of which they don't seem to be rushing, appointing his successor. We'll go through some of the kind of main candidates. Thank you for the viewer suggestion for this video. And kind of what's their background, how might they fit or how might they not. And you guys can let us know your thoughts on who you reckon should get the Aussie job. The first one I'm going to go with is Andy Friend. Andy Friend. What does he have going for him? What's his background? Well, he's spent time coaching in many parts of the world. He's coached Harlequins way back in the day, left them to come back to Australia, coached the Brumbies, did that for a couple of years, ended up getting sacked by the Brumbies. He's coached in Japan. He's coached the Aussie Sevens team, the men's sevens team. He got replaced in that role as well. So his last couple of gigs in Australia sadly haven't gone that well. But his most recent gig was in Ireland, coaching Connacht. And there I think he did a pretty good job. He's coaching Connacht, which is kind of the probably financially the least well-resourced, put it that way, of the four kind of Irish provinces. So he's always kind of been up against it with Connacht. But I think for a team which is always kind of the underdog in the Irish teams, it did pretty well. They tended to have either a playoffs or just outside the playoffs record, and they played some pretty exciting rugby. So you could draw some parallels to the fact that, you know, the Wallabies at the minute, if you compare them to some of the kind of rugby championship rivals, Australia against New Zealand and South Africa at the moment, South Africa and New Zealand were the two World Cup finalists, and the Argentinians made a semi, whereas the Aussies didn't get out of their pool. So maybe that kind of background, having been the small fish, could work well for him until he can kind of build Aussie rugby back to being one of the big fish. But yeah, he certainly did well with Connacht. He wasn't sacked by Connacht. I think they could have kept him if he'd wanted to stay, but he decided to leave. So he's an Australian. That goes, I think, one tick in the box. It's always nice to have someone from your own country coaching your national team. He plays exciting rugby, and I think his lack of international experience is maybe balanced by the fact that he has, he's got sevens international experience, but by the fact that he's done pretty good job with the limited resources he had at Connacht compared to some of his kind of bigger rivals. So Andy Friend, one of the potential candidates. The fact that he's kind of been sacked twice from Aussie jobs maybe doesn't stand him in such good stead. Another one of the guys who's been linked with the job is Dan McKellar. Now, he's had a coaching background as the kind of assistant and as the head coach. He's been assistant to the Brumbies, head coach of the Brumbies. He was assistant with the Wallabies, and I guess he was kind of the heir apparent to Dave Rennie. If Dave Rennie had stayed on, gone through his term, and then seen out his contract, Dan McKellar was probably the next cab off the rank. But with Dave sacking, that plan kind of went out the window. So Dan explored his own opportunities, heading north to take over Leicester Tigers. So he's another one who doesn't have any international experience, at least in coaching 15s. But he does have the tick box of being an Australian, which I think is good. He's been in the Wallabies setup, which is good, so he'll know a lot of the players. And I honestly think he's a pretty pragmatic coach. He gets the most out of the resources that he's got. He doesn't necessarily have a style that he wants to play. I feel like he's quite capable of getting just the best, game plan from the players that he's got. His early run with Leicester, I don't think went that swimmingly, but that was started during the World Cup, so a lot of the guys weren't back with their team. But more recently, I think they're on a pretty good winning run. I think his run with the Brumbies was pretty good in the scheme of things. Obviously, New Zealand teams have been dominant, but the Brumbies under him were kind of flying the flag. And like I said, he's been in the mix with the Wallabies before, just not in the head coaching role. So Dan McKellar, the one thing that I guess stands in his way is the fact that he's got a really long-term deal. They didn't say how long-term the deal is. They just announced that he's signed for Leicester Tigers on a long-term deal. So if Australia have to buy somebody out, they're going to be spending a lot of money on buying people out of contracts. They bought out Dave Rennie. Thankfully for them, Eddie resigned without needing a payout. But yeah, supposedly I've read that he might have an out clause in his contract if the Wallabies come and knocking, but Leicester would be loath to lose another coach because they lost Steve Borthwick to the England job. I don't know. When he's been asked about it, he seemed to kind of distance himself from the role, but who knows? I reckon he'd be a good appointment if he got the job, but the fact that he does have that long-term deal, I think keeps things kind of, less likely. The one guy who I think, personally, is the favourite is Stephen Larkham. I reckon he's the favourite. Is he the right guy for the job? That remains a bit of a question because Larkham, although one of the best players of his generation, just did amazing things on the field, I don't think has taken to coaching in quite the same way, and often that's the case. Some of the best coaches, look at a lot of the top coaches nowadays, are guys who didn't have stellar playing careers, because a lot of the guys who maybe couldn't quite make it as players, not exclusively, there's no hard and fast rule to these things, but a lot of the guys who make good coaches were the guys who were kind of almost there as players but didn't quite have that X factor. Well, Larkham was an X factor player, but I didn't find him an X factor coach. Like when he was assistant coach at the Brumbies, and then he got the head coaching role at the Brumbies, and I feel like the Brumbies kind of regressed under Larkham. They just played boring rugby. Like they were always, I think, decent with their record, but then maybe that last season where he was coaching, where all the Aussie teams did kind of poorly, was maybe not that flash, but like they scored all their tries through mauls, and that's not a bad thing, but they were a really one-dimensional team, kind of predictable. And they had better attacking weapons than he was going to give them credit for. You look back at the stats, they were always like second to last, I think, for like clean breaks and defenders beat and all that kind of stuff. Like not a very good team to watch. And if you can figure out their maul, basically you had the Brumbies number. So, yeah, I don't think he was great with the Brumbies. He was the assistant coach for Cheika at the Wallabies, but by all accounts, Cheika didn't like having him there, and they didn't really kind of see eye to eye, so I don't think he was actually seeing much input. So I don't think, because Australia's attack was not flash at that point either, I don't think we can put that much on Larkham. But then he got the Munster assistant coaching role, and they were all, as the attack coach, and they were also genuinely awful to watch. Munster, since the current coaching setup has left, which was Van Graan and Larkham, their attacks come on leaps and bounds. Some of it's the playing roster, but honestly, they were a really tough team to watch when Larkham was the attack coach. So he is back at the Brumbies now. He is the head coach, and I do think they are playing better rugby now. So maybe it's just one of those ones where it takes a while to get better at something. That's just often the way humans work. Practice makes perfect. So maybe he is getting there now. In those first few years, he was a little bit more conservative, and he's starting to branch out a bit more. I do think he's the favourite for the role, given he's based in Australia. He's got the reputation. He's got the name. He seems to have the nous. I think he'll probably need some good assistance with him. He's never had an international team before, but yeah, I do think he's on the right track. I think it might be one cycle too early for the World Cup for him at the moment, but I still think he's the front runner. One guy that the media tells us, though, is the front runner is this guy, Joe Schmidt from New Zealand. Obviously made his coaching mark more recently with Ireland. That Irish side he had did all kinds of wonderful things. Maybe a little bit, I don't want to say soured, but it's been a little bit overshadowed by what Andy Farrell has kind of gone on to do with them. They look a more balanced side under Andy Farrell. They looked a little bit wooden at times, I guess. Like Joe Schmidt had his plan, but if you could figure out his plan, then they were kind of an easier team to defend against. As was shown, like they had a great 2018. And by the time we got to 2019, teams had kind of figured the Irish out. Like they lost that game against Japan. They lost the quarterfinal pretty handily against New Zealand. But then he decides to come back home, takes a step away from coaching. When Ian Foster's in trouble, the All Blacks or New Zealand rugby comes a calling. And he seems to have a good impact with Ian Foster's All Blacks. He does seem to have that nous of figuring other teams out, of finding chinks in the armour. And there's been rumours that Pete Horn is going to be appointed to some kind of high-performance role in Aussie rugby. And if he gets the role, he'll be the one kind of pushing for Joe Schmidt's appointment because of their kind of connection to each other. So, yeah, I'm not sure how this would work with Joe Schmidt's wanting to kind of spend more time with family thing. I guess Australia's not that far from New Zealand. That would be seemingly kind of one of the roadblocks, but he initially didn't want to do any coaching. Then he took a step to the, consultancy with the All Blacks and then a full assistant with the All Blacks. So maybe he does seem kind of open to going back into more full-time work. So Joe Schmidt, I mean, he's a good coach. So I don't think the Wallabies would regress under him. I think they would find certainly some good opportunities. One other guy who's been in the international scene recently, Michael Cheika. Michael Cheika's been linked with the role. I don't think Cheika would be a good appointment. He's been linked with an extension with the Pumas. So by all accounts, that is in negotiations, but they haven't quite signed across the dotted line just yet. But Michael Cheika's kind of been there and done that. He was the coach of the Wallabies from 2014 to 2019. He's had his run-ins with the Rugby Australian board as well. They appointed like a director of rugby over him and were a selection panel with him because when he was in charge of things, he was a little bit stubborn. By all accounts, especially some of his selections and his tactical decisions seem to be a little bit off. Yeah, he seems to be a guy who plays a little bit of favourites. He seems to be very tense. Like he seems mostly much more relaxed in the Argentinian job than he ever did in the Wallabies job. Barring that kind of third place match at the Rugby World Cup where he was steaming, mostly you watch his press conferences with the Pumas and he seems like he's in a much happier place with the Pumas than he was in Australia. I don't think he likes the meddling. I think he likes being the top man. But for Michael Cheika, as a man manager, I think he'll do all right. But I do think he needs a very good attack coach if he's going to get that job, because we saw it when the Wallabies went out in 2019. They were tactically behind the 8 ball, and then the Pumas, although they made a semi-final, they are a more dangerous side than what we saw from what Michael Cheika was able to get out of them. And Ledesma before that. So maybe the problem with the Pumas goes a little bit more deep than that. I do think that having the guys scattered around the world and having to get them together kind of short notice doesn't help things. But yeah, Cheika's focus on the fundamentals is fine and good, but you also need to kind of take it to that next level. So yeah, I don't think Cheika, just given we've already been there and we've seen the results, I think it's not the right move personally. But he is one guy who's been linked with the job, at least until he signs across the line with the Pumas to extend. They're obviously grooming, I think, Contepomi for that job, but we'll kind of have to wait and see. Another guy who's been linked is Ian Foster. I'm not sure if I put his name on the board. I think he would love the revenge factor to get a chance to go up against Razor. But yeah, we don't know what Fozzie's doing. Fozzie said he's still going to coach. But yeah, I don't know. That would be a big call. As I said, I think the main draw for Fozzie would be trying to get one over New Zealand Rugby, because obviously he left with a pretty poor relationship with them. But no, I don't think Fozzie would be the guy. Personally, Robbie Deans has been kind of linked to the job, but he said, you don't go back. So I'm sure there are other potential candidates. But if I had to pick one, I would say Larkham is the favourite. He's Australian. He's coaching locally. He's had success. His coaching is getting better. So yeah, I think Larkham was probably the favourite personally. For a kind of non-Australian bet, then obviously Joe Schmidt, if the connection with Pete Horn is true and that all kind of comes to play. Dan McKellar, man, I kind of wish if they'd kept Rennie, then Dan McKellar, I think, would be the natural next appointment. But he's on a long-term deal with Leicester Tigers, so I don't think it's going to happen. Maybe in the future. I do think Dan McKellar is a good coach, so we'll kind of have to wait and see. But you guys, let us know your thoughts. Who do you reckon is the favourite? Who would you like to see get the job? Would you like to see Cheika back in the job just to see him steaming at the press conferences again? Do you think Joe Schmidt, with his kind of rugby IQ, could be the one to unlock some secrets? If you want to check out my other channel, it's called 2 Cents on Tour. I recently went to a place in China where I couldn't film. And yeah, I mentioned that in a YouTube title. There are some places you can't film in China. And recently, the YouTube algorithm seems to be promoting that video a little bit. And some people who don't know me are, no, I wouldn't say having a go at me in the comments, but they are pointing out that many countries have places you can't film, which is probably true. But if you want to check that video out, me wandering around in China, up there, down there, 2 Cents on Tour, it's something a bit different. But yes, you guys take care, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.